Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, researcher, and friend, John McKinnon, the author of The Persuasive Preacher, The Gifted Prophet, and The Noble Politician. And together, we're discussing Weaponized Religion, how Christian identity fused with early Christian fundamentalism and politics to form the foundation for the new Apostolic Reformation. John, today we have such a wild ride. This is one of the most crazy, most interesting stories that I've come across, and it, ironically, it's really is the foundation for where we're headed. But as we talk about it, it's going to seem so distant and disconnected. But we're focusing on William Branham's mentor, William Branham being the leader of the post-World War II healing revival, his mentor being Roy E. Davis, who planted Branham's church in Jeffersonville, Indiana. And it's such an interesting story because while Davis is all over the place in history, you read through the newspaper articles and you find him in nearly, states from California all the way to Georgia and everywhere in between. And it looks like he's somewhat disconnected, but you can find him working with the Baptists in the South, the Church of God people, the Pentecostals, we have actually where he held debates defending the Assemblies of God. And I mean, this guy's all over the place. He was on the front page of the Voice of Healing magazine advertising his latter rain revivals. So he's so connected to everything, but he's also connected to politics. And he is not the reason, but he's one of the key figures who is bringing the weaponized religion weaponized religion framework with politics fusing with religion in the early 1900s all the way through the latter rain movement. This man was critical in doing this, working with other key figures which we can recognize doing this in other places, in other areas. And so we have to give a background on him, which we have done in the past, but much of that research was, as we were giving the early history of Roy Davis, much of that research was in its early phases. We did not know that he admitted in I think it was the 1950s, that he was one of the men who wrote the bylaws for the 1915 Ku Klux Klan. And we discovered even later that he was the second in command of that Klan, working directly under William Joseph Simmons. So our early picture of Roy Davis, it's painted entirely different whenever you understand what all he was involved with.
John, I would agree. This episode and others that follow, it'll be a wild ride. And it'll be a good ride as we delve into this history. And for those that have never studied this history, this is pretty fascinating because it really relates to the fabric of America and what was going on during that time and how things evolved and how offshoots of this went into various offshoots of religion, and how it even is in that, like you mentioned, the New Apostolic Reformation, there's fibers of it still there. But I think Roy Davis is such a unique character. He's worth spending some time on. He really intrigued me as you follow his trail, and you really have to dig deep and to really follow his trail, because he was known for using aliases, disguising himself and trying not to make himself known. But as we'll see, it's so fortunate that things would happen that would expose him, whether it be the woman in Georgia that recognized him from a meeting in Texas, that he tried to deny he was that person, and that just brought his world down at the time. But he always managed to have a way to bounce back. I mean, he was very resilient. He didn't let one incident get him down. I think he had a determination in him. And he might have been one of the first successful ministers, or so-called ministers, that used the ministry to promote his agenda. It was his ministry was or his agenda was not so much ministry as it was the white supremacy, as it was the Klan agenda, and as it was politics. And so it made a blending of politics and religion, and he never stopped doing that. And he used his mentees along the way, such as Branham. He brought him under his wing and taught him the reins of what he was doing. And although Branham didn't embrace the political agenda so much, but he used his ministry to promote those ideas, further as he traveled through his ministry. So it'll be a very interesting ride, and we got quite a few other characters to introduce. Even the man that started the Klan itself back in 1915, the second wave, and Roy did admit, I believe it was 1961, but he admitted to having a part in those bylaws, and that'll be interesting to talk about how and the time frame of when he would have probably done that. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this, John. It's going to be really fun.
Yeah, this is a crazy history. And, to fully understand the history, we have to broaden what we talk about a bit, because while the character himself is incredibly interesting, you have to understand the time period in which he was living. And he was nothing more than a grifter in his early days, but he was a grifter with an agenda, which makes it really funny. And you have to understand that it was during this time, C.A.L. Totten, his works on British Israelism were widespread, and they were starting to morph at this point of time into what later became Christian identity. It was bringing in the racial elements. It was getting on the borderline of anti-Semitic. It really became that later. But C.A.L. Totten laid the framework for all of that, which would be picked up and turned into, this goes all the way to the Christian nationalists, the Aryan nations, skinheads. I mean, this is a very, very dark history when you start taking the path forward. But during this point of time in which Davis is building his criminal and religious career, both at the same time, he was in the South. He was from Texas, and this was during a period of time in American history when the nation itself was transitioning. The nation, they were in the southern states. They were forced to release the slaves, and they were forced to allow the slaves, the people with black skin, to now enter into the workplace, and they were seeing people who they literally owned now working beside them, which was awkward for people in the South. And at the same time, you had this massive influx of Jews. And the Jewish people were coming into the United States, and they were taking a lot of the white-collar jobs. And this became a significant problem in some of the bigger states, because while people who had a heritage in that state, and they had this family lineage, were sometimes struggling to find work, you had people from out of the country, Jewish people, coming in, and they were taking up the really good jobs in some cases in some cities. And this is not opinion. You can go read some of this history even on the internet. You can read some of that history. But what happened was, it painted this picture that the people with black skin were rising up while the people with white skin were being suppressed or oppressed, and they feared that it was going to flip, that the nation would become a nation of people with dark skin in the southern states. And so C.A.L. Totten's anti-Semitic themes and his racist themes that was emerging in the British Israel movement was quite popular among some of the people in the South that were witnessing all of this happening. And Davis was right in the heart of where this was in the worst. As we mentioned in the last episode, being from Paris, Texas, he is coming from a very extremely violent and racist community, and this really had an impact on him in the early years. And to some extent, trying to put myself in his shoes, which is nearly impossible, I can see that while he was doing some things that were illegal, unethical, criminal, and just, he's all over not a really good guy. Some of the things he's doing, I think he justified in his mind because of his political and religious positions. And so he felt like he could do this, and it was for a better cause.
Yeah, John, I think in his mind, in Davis's mind, he was doing what was right for America. He had these views, and he was very racist, but in his mind, he was trying to make America what it once was back when his family maybe owned slaves or whatever, and he could see the white race in general may have been being competed with other races and with the immigration issue. I guess the immigration of the Jewish people or in others, Italian descent or whoever, coming into New York and flooding New York and taking up a lot of factory jobs, as well as now the Civil War had been over for many years. And also seeing those things happen, and also for the Catholic religion being afraid of that because of the scares of, they're under a different national government if you're a Catholic, so you're not loyal to America. So the whole thing was, we want America to be white. We want loyal people to America, because it's not too far after the Revolution, when America broke from Britain, and colonists were pretty fierce in their determination to be independent, and that heritage, that history had made its way all the way through the Civil War, because that's what they fought over their wanting to be independent and have their slavery, and the South had that in their fabric of their being. So to be an American meant you were going to resist all forms of tyranny, and they saw the Catholic religion as tyranny. They saw the Jewish influx, being they've taken over the banking institutions, and then they saw the black race now, once being our servants, now they could become our masters. So to keep all that suppressed and to keep the white race in power, he definitely, it was ripe for that type of organization. And the first Klan that started back in the 1860s in Tennessee had made its way into Texas and had made its way throughout Georgia. So by the time, when William Simmons began to think about the start of a new Klan, because the first Klan basically fizzled out at about the mid-1870s, because it quickly became violent, but it was organized to support the white race supremacy, to oppose the racist mixing, to resist the carpetbaggers from New York from coming, and to restore the white control of the government back to the government. So that's what it was all about. But quickly escalated into violence, and then in the mid 1870s or 1871, Congress passed an act that would suspend writ of habeas corpus if you have a secret conspiracy, if you're caught in a criminal act as part of a secret conspiracy, which the Klan could meet that definition, and so you could be held indefinitely and not being able to get a trial. So that's what made the Klan fizzle out. But we're going to get into how Simmons began thinking about the Klan and when that all happened here. But right there in the heart of Davis's hometown, Paris, and all, I'm sure the memories were still there. And he was born around 1890, and so I'm sure people kept talking about what the Klan did back in those days. So by the time he got involved, he was already well acquainted with what the history of that was.
Exactly. And some of the ideas that came into the Latter Rain movement through William Branham maybe not originated with, but was taught to Branham from Davis. We know this very clearly because the serpent seed doctrine, while William Branham denied it in the early years that there were two bloodlines, in the later years he was teaching the the two-seed doctrine of Christian identity. But in the years that he denied it, he was admitting that he learned this in Roy Davis's church, and he was talking about the most extreme racist form, where they were talking about the people with black skin came from the apes or the monkeys. And as we mentioned in the last episode, you had people like Daniel Parker, who had influence all the way down into Texas. Well, as Davis progresses through his life, he also had influence from the Church of God, and Russell Kelso Carter was a prominent Church of God holiness minister who was a follower of C.A.L. Totten, and he was teaching also the dual seed, the two-seed doctrine. So Davis has this line of influence that if you trace it from his origins in Texas all the way up to the NAR, you can see it's not the same doctrine when it comes out on the other end, but you can see how it morphed and changed and progressed and evolved over time into this this weird thing that exists today. But to kick off his origin story, you have to look back into the history in Texas and understand that, he was a Baptist minister, or posing as a Baptist minister, one or the other, in Texas, and he was a grifter. He was riding the rails, and he was planting churches all throughout Texas. And he was an author. We don't know yet if he had gone to college or not. In some cases, he claimed that he was Dr. Roy E. Davis, and other cases, he's not. But he had this wide swath of influence. And as he's riding the rails from church to church in Texas, he begins broadening and expanding his areas of influence, covering from Oklahoma into Texas into Louisiana. And he literally starts covering the entire eastern side of the southern United States. And while he's doing this, he becomes a church planter, and he's planted several churches. And it appears from what we can tell that he was actually the pastor of some of these churches. And we have evidence that suggests that some churches were not aware that he was the pastor of the other churches he had, which gets really funny when you think about it, because as he's collecting tithes from Church A and traveling to Church B and C and D and so forth, well, he is collecting these tithes to go on his mission trips and then doing the same thing from the other churches. So he's not double dipping, it's triple, quadruple. We don't even know how many churches he had, but he realizes that, hey, there is a heck of a lot of money in this religious thing.
Yeah, John, I would agree. He was a very sharp man. I mean, as awful as he was very smart and shrewd. So he knew he had some talents. I mean, he had a singing talent, and I think that carried him a long ways in his career. And what he was doing was his singing ability, his charm, and his very wits about him too. And somewhere along the line, he got some legal advice or was studied law in some way, because he managed, every time he was involved in a court trial, or maybe he had some friends at the top, but he just managed to wiggle out of things. He was like a worm. He could just wiggle out of anything almost. He could get the support of the people behind him. But he was very smart in using the newspapers, and throughout his career, he actually managed some newspapers and just wrote in the newspapers a whole lot. That's just what he did to get his public swayed to his opinion. But so back in I guess it was, he was probably he was 20 years old around 1908, and Colonel Simmons said he had thought about the Klan for 14 years before he began it in 1915. So you would think you'd have to be around 20 years old or so, or 18, to when he said years later he wrote the bylaws of the Klan. So he probably started working with Colonel Simmons somewhere around 1908, 1910, and by 1915 the Klan was launched. But Simmons says he claimed the idea of the Klan came to him while he was doing circuit riding ministry in Alabama. And he had a mystical vision, but I'm sure Colonel Simmons was well aware of the Klan's activities back in the 1870s as well. He was about the same age as, I think he was 10 years older than Davis. But, he said he took him 14 years to think about how to start this again. But a lot of things came together in 1915 that gave it the momentum it needed. And he just decided it was time to launch it once again. But while he was there dreaming up this, and maybe Davis joining him at some point, because Davis had started ministry out in Texas. And like you said, how he managed to be minister of several churches. He could convince, I guess, one church that after he got established for several months, the common people there, and he won them over, then he would just leave and go and do the same somewhere else. And he might be telling them, I need to go evangelize, or I'm going to do ministry here. And they still support him. So he was collecting money multiple places along the way. He had this knack about him to know where the money was and how to find it. He did that all through Texas. He did that through Georgia. He was even going back and forth to Georgia and Texas until he was discovered. And then he tried to make it in Georgia, but he pastored many churches in Georgia at the same time. So until he was found out.
Yeah, I never will forget whenever I first discovered all of this history. I was actually tipped off. I've never told that story, but I was tipped off by a former Message believer that the Message was founded by the Imperial Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And I'll admit, whenever I was first told this, I was in disbelief. I really did not believe it. I knew that Roy Davis was William Branham's mentor, pastor. He was connected to William Branham from, I think we've traced it back as early as the 1920s, all the way to 1965 when he died. These two men were connected, and you can find some rivalries in the middle of this, but in the end, they were still connected so deeply that when Davis was the Imperial Wizard and not even the United States government knew where he was, William Branham knew his travel itinerary, and he would say, Roy Davis is in this meeting, and then say, no, he's in, I got word from, who did he get word from? I got word that he was in Florida at this time. Who gives the leader of the post-World War II healing revival the travel itinerary of the most notorious white supremacy figure in the United States? So you know that there is a connection. We don't know how deep that ran, but there is a deep connection. But I was tipped off, and I began looking into it. And I didn't understand it at first because I could see Roy Davis in this city, and then this other city, and then this other city. And my first thought was, well, that's a common name. There's so many different Roy Davises in the world. There's no way this is the same, even if it said Reverend Roy Davis. And then I started seeing newspaper articles referencing some of those cities by the other men. So I knew that they were the same guy because you can see this path of history where he goes. And it ran all the way into Georgia. And I discovered that article talking about him being identified by the lady in Georgia. So he had planted all these churches, and he was pastoring a church in, can't remember the name of the city, but in Georgia. It was a Baptist church, not far from where I grew up, actually. And he was also pastoring a church in Texas. The two churches were unaware that he was. And he was married to two different women. So he would travel to Texas and be with wife A, and travel to Georgia and be with wife B. And we don't even know if there was a C, D, E, and F. It looks like there may have been, but he had multiple lives in multiple states, pastoring multiple churches. And one woman just happened to be the downfall of it all, because she went to visit her sister in Texas, and Roy Davis was holding this big revival. Everybody's welcome, dinner on the ground, and he's out there, and the woman goes to see him, and, wait a minute. That's the pastor at my church in Georgia. And she saw him, and then all hell broke loose, man. She got very, very angry, and she started talking to the authorities, her Baptist church, and she wanted to kick this man out of the Baptist church, and she, in the end, she did. But when I found all that history, my mind was blown. Like, you can't even make this stuff up.
Yeah, that's one thing about the life of Roy Davis. I kept saying to my wife, when I'd read this stuff, when I first started researching, I said, you just can't make this stuff up. That's the best term for it, because it's just almost unbelievable to hear someone that was so crafty. But, yeah, if no one of our listeners have read that article in the newspaper back in either 1917 or so, after he had swindled the bank in Texas and came to Georgia, and then the woman recognized him, you really need to get a hold of that article and read it. It's so well written. The newspapers back then had some really good writers, and they could make things comical, and it's so fun to read that article. but and how the woman they almost put the dialogue in the paper, so it's almost like reading a novel, and it's very fun to read. But I think I even put the full text of the article in my book because it's just so well written and it tells the story so well. So many things like that. But Davis was when the Klan started in 1915, he was well established as a minister and had that revival in Texas, and then the woman recognized him in Georgia. So he was already making his way into Georgia and kept his wife as long as he could. I think they divorced in 1917 because after this was exposed, the woman was suspicious of him and contacted the sheriff, and the sheriff tracked him down eventually, and his wife, they divorced, and then he ended up staying with his wife in Georgia, who they had a child by named Catherine, a daughter. And eventually he meets his family in Georgia named the Garrisons. And that's an interesting story we'll, I guess, get into eventually. I don't want to get ahead, but there's a little 10-year-old girl in that family that travels with him to Jeffersonville. And eventually, when she's a teenager, that's when he gets into some real trouble up there, with this 10-year-old girl, which she was a teenager by then, but he eventually, I won't spill the beans, but maybe I'll say he eventually married this girl, but he was much older than her. But, so to get back to the Klan, Simmons, who started the Klan back in 1915, and like I said, had thought about it for many years, and Roy had helped him write the bylaws, and Roy was making his way to Georgia by that time. And so in 1915, they had the ceremony, and this was 1 or 2 months after some hatred toward a Jewish person named Leo Frank back in August of 1915. He was being held on some murder charges in jail. And so the people around town there, I guess it was Atlanta, but they just went in and pulled him out of the jail and, I guess stormed the jail, pulled him out and lynched him there with no evidence. So he never got a fair trial. And some of these men went with Simmons to Stone Mountain. So there was some vigilante justice type people that really wanted to push this thing and push this agenda. And they were all for, starting the new Klan. And it was going to be as violent as the old Klan was and turned out to be. But, so they met, in November 27th, I guess, in 1915, and took their solemn oaths. I think it was 29 or so men there. It was, 34 men signed on that time. And so they established that on Stone Mountain that night. And that was right after the movie Birth of the Nation came, which, movies have a way of inciting that fervor. And so that was the beginnings of it. And they did burn a cross, that night, on Stone Mountain. But the interesting thing, cross burning was not part of the original Klan. They didn't burn any crosses back then. It really came from, back in the old Scottish families, back in the day over in Scotland. They would burn crosses back then to summon the men to fight, for their Klan. So back in the days when they fought kings and so forth, they would use crosses to do that. So the Klan adopted that into their organization. Simmons, his organization that he started really kind of got out of hand pretty quickly, after membership started increasing, because the Klan had a way of, taking things into their own hands. And Simmons was not much of a leader. He was a very strong white supremacist, but he was not much of a leader. And we'll see that the Klan basically faded out of his hands pretty quickly. He couldn't keep control of it, and we'll go into that. But it's interesting how much money was to be made, and you wonder if he was in it for the money or in it for other reasons. I think Roy was in it for both. Roy was wanting to promote the thing to the utmost. Simmons seemed to back off and didn't care. He was happy just to get his money and have his position in the Klan. But he was making $1,000 a month at one time, which is the equivalent of $220,000 a year. And that was just to be in the backdrop. That's how much money they paid him to kind of just step aside and take the salary and let us run things. So, it was a lucrative business back then. And I know that's what Roy was after. He was always after money. Like you said, he was a grifter, collected money from any and everybody, and even people that, shouldn't have been given their money in the first place. And he was just a swindler altogether, and posing as a minister.
And you mentioned Leo Frank, who is significant in American history, but he is significant to this story as well. Leo Frank was, most historians say, wrongly convicted for the murder of Mary Fagan. She was an employee of his working in his factory, and he was a Jewish man. But he was a Jewish man from Texas. He was born in Texas, and he eventually landed in Atlanta and started his factory where all of this took place. But it was his trial, conviction, and hanging that eventually led to the creation of both the Ku Klux Klan and the Anti-Defamation League. So he's very pivotal in creating the two sides, the white supremacy side and the side who is fighting the white supremacy. But as it relates to Davis, since we can connect Davis to the early formation of the Klan, Leo Frank was a highly politicized, on both sides of the fence, both the white supremacy and non. He was highly politicized as a tool to weaponize the American anti-Semitism movement. His trial was painted such that he was such a bad man, and he was this Jewish man who had, the Jewish people were rising in Atlanta. He had misused and abused his power to have sex with and murder this female, and literally the entire nation was captivated by this trial. So much so that a lynch mob went and basically kidnapped him out of prison and took him all the way to, I think it was near Atlanta, where the heart of the mob was collected. And as he hung there dead, there were people who were actually taking photographs with the hanging dead body and making postcards so that they could send them out to their relatives that, hey, I stood here as this Jewish man was hanging. So it was not the birth of anti-Semitism in the United States, but it was the catalyst that fueled what came next as the anti-Semitism in the United States began to just spread rapidly. He was the key to all of this. And knowing now that Davis was with the men who wrote the bylaws of the Klan, he was in the very center of all of this controversy, and they were weaponizing his trial and his execution to fuel the spreading of the Ku Klux Klan. And history shows that actually worked, and it worked very well. So we can place Davis right here in the heart of this. And knowing that Davis's history weaves all the way through the latter reign and beyond, the anti-Semitism and the themes that were growing into the latter rain movement are largely a result of Davis, if you take this one point in history.
Several things that occurred there just really fueled the fires of the Klan and fueled the momentum that it got started on. The movie that was put out, Birth of a Nation, the hatred towards Jews and other people of color, that they may have been wrongly accused of crimes. And so it just fueled the fires of the people. And so everybody was ripe for, that type of organization to begin, for the Klan to start. And then you had the Catholic component too, from as opposed to a white Protestant America that they wanted to keep in control of things. So as 1915 started the Klan, it's very likely Roy was there on Stone Mountain with Simmons and his group of 30 or so men. And right after that, not much happened in the Klan. The membership, sort of increased to about 4,000 members. And back then, I don't know how much they charged up until that time, but it was around $10 a head for a member. So, but we'll talk about how it took off after that, maybe later in this episode. But so Roy Davis left Texas about January of 1916. He had just swindled a bank by presenting a check that was probably signed by his brother. And it was a little bit confusing as to how that came about, even if you read the article in the paper. But he was able to cash this check that had no backing of funds. But he cashed the check and he came over to Georgia to, I guess, join Simmons and to start promoting things in Georgia and try to maintain his life back in Texas as well. But it all caught up with him in about a year and a half later, in May of 1917, that's when he was finally caught. But it was due to that lady that recognized him, and he received a 2-year sentence back then, but it was suspended. So he never served any prison time, and I guess it was a small petty crime, so it may not have deserved jail time. But we'll see throughout Roy's life, he did spend some time in prison, a few times, and it's interesting to note that he used an alias when he came to Georgia, so people wouldn't recognize him if his name got well known. He called himself Lon because his full name was Roy Alonzo Davis. So Lon Davis, was a takeoff on the name Alonzo. But the woman recognized him, and she wrote to the sheriff to see if he was wanted, because she was suspicious as to him denying who he was. And the sheriff, sure enough, there was a reward out for him. So she wanted that reward money. She made it clear. What's interesting to note, Roy was about 27 years old about this time, because his birth date ranges from 1888 to 1890. So he was about 25 or 27. And he wrote a note in the paper when he was being held in jail, appealing to the public, and it was almost like a sob story. He said, a few days ago, I was in the state of South Carolina preaching and singing the glorious gospel of the Son of God, when to my surprise, I was arrested and placed in jail on a felony charge of which I absolutely knew nothing of. He said, this is the first time I've ever been placed behind cold prison bars, and you can imagine my surprise and anticipation of a rough handling by the most excellent gentleman who came to me. So you can see how eloquently he can write. And he thanked the sheriff in this letter for his hospitality. I guess he was trying to appeal to the mercies of the sheriff, and he used this letter to get public opinion toward his plight there. So he ended up talking about himself being a minister and how he had no knowledge of how this happened to him, and he was innocent of the charges. But sure enough, he got convicted but got that suspended sentence. But that's just his way of trying to wiggle out of things. He was very shrewd in those ways, John.
He was, and I think that appealed to Simmons, because if you look at what happened with Roy Davis, all of his dirty laundry was aired so many times publicly because he was a very public face, and he was a very popular face. He was popular from Texas to Oklahoma all the way to Georgia, and he had created such a big following. And when all of this dirty laundry was aired, it was aired in multiple locations, wherever he had a presence. And the Klan was aware that that this was aired, because whenever he would make his defense leading up to a trial or a conviction, he would use the Klan as a weapon against whoever was against him. And so whenever it was all brought out, the Klan basically had rejected him. However, it was after that point in time that Simmons began working very closely with Davis, and Davis became William Joseph Simmons' official spokesperson. So Simmons had to have known all of this dirty history, and he simply didn't care, because the influence and power that Davis held over massive amounts of people, that was very appealing to somebody who was trying to spread a white supremacy movement. They really didn't care if this was an ethical guy or not. All they cared was his level of influence, which, if you take it away from the white supremacy side and now flip that over to the religious side, that's also key to understand, because he has that level of influence on both the white supremacy and the religious movements in the United States.
Yeah, John. There's a lot of friends in high places that help you out with the Klan. Being part of the Klan was it's part of a secret society, and they called it the Invisible Empire. And it really might not have taken off in the first 4 years, but by 1920, the membership really took off. And there's some reasons why it took off like it did. In 1920, Simmons, him not being a great leader, Roy was probably doing all he could to promote the Klan, pastoring churches. So he was very busy. But he used those churches that he pastored in Georgia to hold some Klan meetings. And eventually when the deacons would find out, that's when he would be exposed and ousted, because most of the true churches that he was with, the people that were gullible that accepted him, when they found out what he was, they definitely quickly ousted him. But in 1920, there were some publicity promoters of P.T. Barnum's circus named Edward Clark and Elizabeth Tyler, and they were right there in Georgia, and they got involved in the Klan, and they saw the potential for this to grow. And them being promoters, they knew how to manage things so that they could spread the word quickly and get people interested in this. So they had a lot of tools at their disposal, to get this spread and start membership just skyrocketing. So I said there was a $10 membership fee, so they wanted part of that fee, and if they were promised that's how they got involved. It was split amongst them and the leaders and the recruiter. So if you were a recruiter, just a lay member recruiting members, you could probably get $2 to $3 for every person that you recruited into the Klan. So it was very lucrative. It was kind of like these pyramid scheme businesses. For everybody you bring into the business, you'll get so much money. That was in 1920. So it's interesting to bring Davis in here. By 1921 in July, Davis was pastoring the Ackworth Baptist Church, and that's where he began holding some Klan meetings at the church because he wanted his part of that $10 fee. And if he could recruit all the members, the male members of that church, who were obviously white, and all the other churches he was pastoring, he could make a pretty good sum of money there, and then he would have more support, for what he was doing. So they held meetings at the church, and then there were some letters. Somehow the people in Texas, which were the brother-in-law of his wife Emma at the time in Texas, had the children, and they knew what Davis had done in 1915 to swindle the bank and all his history. They put together this letter, and they sent it to the deacons of the church, warning them about Davis. And by that time, of course, he had a second wife and his daughter was 5 years old at the time, his new daughter. He had 3 children with his other wife back in Texas who were growing up. So these charges were brought with him with a letter. And then in my book, I detail this, but after that, they actually sent them a whole box of stuff, a whole box of articles and evidence of what all he had done, because they really wanted to expose the church and say, you don't need this man to be your pastor. And they were wanting to let them know that they need to get rid of him. And so by that time, that's when Davis was exposed. And then he fled to Oklahoma, right after that with his wife, and daughter Catherine. His second wife was named Elva Cotta Davis. So, but Roy's strategy, every time he got accused of something, his strategy was like politicians of today: deny every charge against you, no matter how true it is, and then attack those who make the charge. And that's what his strategy was. And it was turned out to be a pretty good strategy, as it is with politicians today. They get accused of many things, very bad things, and they just deny it. And then they attack the ones bringing the charges and try to bring stuff up on them. But after Roy fled to Oklahoma, the Klan had gained about 100,000 members due to those publicists by September of 1921. And by the end of 1922, it was about 1 million members. So that's quite a few $10 fees paid out. That's $10 million. And then they had, by that time, $6 million in assets in today's money. So quite a bit of money there in the Klan. So quite a lucrative business. So by this time, with the Klan gaining all that membership, now there was factions beginning to develop. Now, there was a man out in Texas named Hiram Wesley Evans. And with Simmons being a very lame leader, he now wanted to oust him as a leader. So they had some disagreements, and by 1923-24 is when it came to a head, and they was able to oust Simmons. So we can go into that as well as a famous newspaper article that exposes Davis again.
I never will forget whenever I started putting all of these images together of the many ways that he was making money. He was making money by swindling people, by his religious campaigns, his evangelical campaigns, he was a faith healer even before the post-World War II healing revival. He was holding faith healing events, and and then you have the pyramid scheme of the Klan. What really struck me as funny is that during his days working with Simmons, he was extremely vocal supporting the Ku Klux Klan. And then whenever, we'll get into this history, down the line, but when the original 1915 Klan fell after being exposed in Washington, he shifted to religion, and he found that there was so much money to be made holding these religious campaigns that he seems to have focused all of his energy and attention to that and just put the whole white supremacy pyramid scheme to the side while he made all of his money in religion, which is really funny when you think of how this progressed over time. He being William Branham's mentor, and then Branham holding similar revivals, very, very similar to how Roy Davis was doing it. And the newspaper articles described in the newspapers were describing the meetings with William Branham where it required two hefty men to carry the suitcases of money away from the revivals. So this is something that he learned from Roy Davis. And again, you trace this all the way into the New Apostolic Reformation today. The most common thing among all of these movements that appear to have no connections, the thing that binds them all together is the money. Because every single one of these weird religious groups that exist today, everybody's crying out, they're making so much money. Look at their mansions and their airplanes and their big buildings, all of this stuff. Well, Davis was the prototype for this big expansion of mixing politics, religion with swindling the people with getting their money.
Yeah, the money trail is where it's at, and that's, if you follow the money trail, it generally leads to what you're looking for. For Branham did learn a lot of his techniques from Davis, I'm sure, and they were chummy. I mean, even if you read the 1950 Voice of Healing article, it's very revealing. All Davis said in there, Davis pretty much refuted the life story of Branham in that, and how he came into the ministry. But the offering part, Branham's always said, I never took an offering. Just another half truth. Of course, he took up offerings every meeting he had, probably, because it was known, like you said, they carried suitcases full of money out of the building. So how he was able to say, I never took an offering, I don't know. Maybe he could say that and say, I didn't participate in passing the hat. But his leaders with him, or his associates with him, definitely took the offering up. So the money was a big thing. And we know the assets he had when he died, it was quite a sum of money, much more money than I'd ever see in my lifetime. But so Evans was in competition with Simmons because Evans wanted to lead the Klan. I think he was a dentist, very educated man, but he wanted to oust Simmons as leader. So by 1924, Simmons sold his rights to the Klan, because Simmons owned the copyright. He copyrighted this and owned the rights to everything about the Klan. But in the end, Simmons gave up his rights to it and sold those in 1924. And it's interesting to note that I don't have the article right at hand here, but there's a famous Macon article. See, Roy was in Oklahoma at this time from 1921 to 23, but Roy just couldn't wait to get back to Georgia. He had to let the fires that flamed up while he was in Ackworth Baptist Church and all these other churches he was pastoring die down. The publicity that he got in 1921 when he fled to go live in Oklahoma and pastor that church for a couple of years. He let those fires die down, but he was just anxious to get back to Georgia because that's where all the action was. But I'm sure he promoted the Klan while he was in Oklahoma up there, wrote articles for the paper. And if you look at the trail of newspaper articles about him pastoring churches up there, it's almost like he left abruptly. There was not much of a trail off saying, there was no article saying, oh, the pastor of our churches now has decided, or he's called back to Georgia. It's almost like he just left town and just left them hanging, which is he was prone to do. He would leave town suddenly, just like he did in Jeffersonville when he finally made it up there, or Louisville. He would leave town, and he would have others that would take over to carry on what he was doing, such as the way Branham did up in Jeffersonville. But so with Evans in charge, he came back to Georgia in 1923, and Davis, they may have forgotten him. He worked in some different towns, but he became head of the Farmers Union. He pastored additional churches. He made his way down into South Georgia, towns called like Meigs, Georgia, Tipton, Georgia. And then in 1923, in Macon, Georgia, a famous article in July of 1923 came out. So he had already come back to Georgia for maybe a year or two and was just getting started again. And then this article came out about his dual life that he led. And then the Farmers Union ousted him on account of that. They wanted no part of Roy Davis when they realized who he was. So that was the second downfall of Davis in Georgia. He didn't make it very long again. And some interesting things happened in Meigs, Georgia. He was down there quite a bit. He actually ran a newspaper down there called the Brickbat, which was strictly a Klan newspaper promoting the Klan. And when he had to give that up because of this article that came out in Macon, and that's a very interesting article. Our listeners ought to look up and read. I dug it up and actually contacted the newspaper in Macon itself to get the article, because you can't find it on newspapers.com. So I actually got a copy of that, and they were so willing to do that for me, which I was very glad to get it, because I wanted the full article, had a piece of it. But down in Meigs, after he left that, and because the Brickbat was being accused of being, very racist, very Klan oriented, and it's funny that the whole newspaper and a man lost his business. The man that ran the newspaper for the town there after he took over after Davis, it burned completely to the ground, and he lost his house, his newspaper. And you wonder sometimes if Davis didn't have a hand in that, because there were several times in the pattern of Davis's life that things burned down when he was a part of it. That newspaper place was one. Even Brother Branham said the press that he was running in Jeffersonville burned down one night. And then when Davis left town, his church burned down. So there was many times like that. So you wonder if Davis was not also an arsonist in some ways, or the folks that hated him so much, made sure his ventures didn't make it as well. So it's kind of interesting to see that pattern in his life as well.
It's just such a crazy, fascinating history. And I'm sure the listeners who they're expecting us to be talking about the framework of the New Apostolic Reformation. What does this grifter have to do with everything? And as we'll show as we go on, he has everything to do with this thing. This is one of the most connected men in religion, politics, white supremacy, the whole gambit, right? And he's a criminal, and he is a bigamist. He's got multiple wives, multiple states, and he is taking small girls across state lines to have sex with them, which is, it's another story for another day. But all of that trail of history, where this gets really interesting and critical to understand, that history follows him everywhere he goes, because he's such a outspoken, such a public, violently opposed to different factions of religion and politics, that whenever his opposition rises up, they try to dig up dirt on him. Well, oh my gosh, the dirt that they can find on this guy is unbelievable. So then it gets published in newspapers almost everywhere he goes. And like you said, it makes people angry when they realize that they have been deceived by one of the most vile individuals known to man. And so they'll burn down his house, his church, his printing presses, or he's doing it himself, so it looks like they do. We don't know, but something happens everywhere he goes. And it is this man who inspires the leader of the post-World War II healing revival, one of two catalysts for the latter rain movement. The other catalyst, which gets funny, I'll play the clip here in a minute, but the other catalyst, Franklin Hall, they openly talked about starting with money. They would start their revivals, and they were laughing about the amount of money they were collecting. And I'll just let Franklin Hall speak for himself, and William Branham with him.
What are you going to start it with?
I'm going to start
Some money, huh?
Some money.
All right, good. I'll help you start.
All right, so that's fine.
And, so this whole thing is about money. It's pure, plain, and simple.
Yeah.
It is all about money. So this guy goes into into Louisville, Kentucky, gets ran out of Louisville and is trying to run from the law, plants the church that literally becomes the headquarter church for what became
for the message
for the post-World War II healing revival. And while all of this is going on, his dirty laundry is being aired all over the newspapers. So every single person who's connected to him in that church is also aware that this is not a very good man, but they stick with him. And what I have what I've come to understand in all of this is that it wasn't just that he was a grifter. This was a very brilliant leader, because he would go into an area, he would plant a church, and he would make them so charged for his agenda that whenever he would get sent to prison, ran out of town, whatever it was, they would continue his agenda in that location. And as we'll get further in the history, we'll come to understand, he did the same thing in Jeffersonville, Indiana, and William Branham is literally continuing his agenda and mimicking every single aspect of his ministry, from the faith healing to the collection of money to the printing press, to the whole bit. He literally becomes a clone of Roy E. Davis, which is so funny. But we'll get into that more as we go, and there's just so much more to talk about. As we were talking through this, John, I was thinking of about 15 episodes that we could do just right here in this time period on Davis, but we'll keep focused, and the listeners can follow us as we go through what eventually led to the NAR. If you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more information about Roy Davis and William Branham, read The Persuasive Preacher, The Gifted Prophet, and The Noble Politician. For more information on the dark side of latter rain, read Weaponized Religion, From Latter Rain to Colonia Dignidad. Available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.